Racism, subtly or not, prevails in Malaysia. From your doorstep up to the gateway of super corridors, you can never dodge the affirmation that you belong to a certain race and the social characteristics that represent that particular society. Along the way, we had seen and felt the charisma of 5 different prime ministers and their slogans depicting the utopian Malaysian society. But the stark reality of racial segregation and ethnic divide in Malaysia had yet to change. The irony is that the Malaysian in pre-independence was more Malaysian than the Malaysians today, although there were more programs and policy changes made by the government. But the Malaysian society is seen going backward, where the sentiments are growing and becoming stronger like never before. In the quest of examining the quagmire of race relations, MalaysiaKini spoke to Dr. A. Farish Noor, a political historian and is presently a senior fellow at the Nanyang Technological University in Singapore.
Well, actually, if we go back to the pre-independence period, talking about pre-1957, but if we can go back even further than that to the 19th century, historically, from what anecdotal evidence we have, what documentary evidence we have, we do have a very different image of what proto-Malaysian or pre-Malaysian society looked like. Now, one of the most interesting features about this society in the 19th century was the extent to which it was far more complex, far more plural, far more cosmopolitan than what we see in Malaysia today. And the level of comfort that the respective communities had vis-a-vis themselves and each other. So if we look back at the social environment in places like Penang, Malacca, Singapore, and many of the other urban coastal settlements in the Dutch East Indies or Indonesia as well, you'll see that there were communities that were living not side by side, not simply side by side, but in many cases actually overlapping and interpenetrating with one another. A lot of hybrid communities. This was a time in the 19th century where interracial or interracial, intercultural marriages, interreligious marriages were far more common. And as a result, it created a social environment that was far more complex than what we are accustomed to today. This is how and why the whole phenomenon of the Peranakan culture emerged in many parts of Southeast Asia. And Peranakan, we have to remember, did not simply refer to the Peranakan community that were originally from China, but you're talking about a community in general that included Europeans, Arabs, Indians, it included, of course, all the pre-Bumi peoples of Southeast Asia, and it also produced a very hybrid culture. And this hybrid culture is still with us, till today. We see it in the language that we use. The common lingua franca that we use is made up of words and terms that come from practically every language in Asia. That's why Bahasa Malaysia has to be understood in a non-racialized, non-ethnic sense, because not a single community can claim monopoly on Bahasa Malaysia. Almost 40% of the words in Bahasa Malaysia is made up of Sanskrit terms, which points to our pre-Islamic Hindu-Buddhist past. So this is the historical context, the long historical cultural context from which Malaysia emerged. However, I think one of the major problems faced by the first generation of post-independence rulers and governors of Malaysia was that they had not successfully challenged the mindset of the colonial administration that had, for a period of about 100 years, practiced a form of divisive divide and rule politics in Malaysia for the sake of maintaining structures of colonial power and exploitation. So it has to be remembered that it was during the colonial period. It was during the colonial period that the concept of race was first introduced. And that's why in the Malaysian language, like many of the languages of Southeast Asia, Bahasa Indonesia, Tagalog, Thai, there is no word that can be compared to the word race, because this is an alien concept. And yet race and race politics was introduced to Southeast Asia as a means of dividing between the communities according to racial ethnic blocks. And I think this was one of the obstacles that the first generation of post-independence leaders faced. Now, of course, that interracial, interethnic compromise was unstable from the beginning, for the simple reason that it was simply an elite compromise that did not take into account the realities of Malaysian society then. And post-69, post-NEP, I think we have seen really the rise of both racial ethnic as well as religious politics in Malaysia on a scale that is unprecedented. And this for me is the most worrying trend, that we are today so far away from the inclusive, universal, plural, cosmopolitan culture that was the norm in Southeast Asia 200 years ago. If anything, we've gone backwards. We seem to have retreated back into the very divisive and I think potentially dangerous politics of ethnic and religious sectarianism. And this is one of the reasons why I think Malaysia, as compared to Indonesia next door, has not been able to make the gains that we had expected after the Reformasi era of 1997.
The racial riot in 13 May 1969 had definitely altered the racial relationship landscape in Malaysia. To appease the tension and reassure that the well-being of the Malaysians are taken care, the government initiated the National Economic Policy. Though the intention was good, but as the policies was coming to an end, the outcome was very doubtful, whereby the disparity between races became a bigger issue.
Again, when we talk about the new economic policy, I mean the new economic policy was from the outset a form of state intervention in the form of affirmative action policies that were designed to help impoverished or marginalized communities. In principle, of course, I have nothing against that, and I don't think anyone does. I think the problem lies in the way in which the NEP was politically instrumentalized by certain groups, notably the UMNO party and the ruling elite in Malaysia, and how it was then ultimately, and this we see in the writings of people like Jomo and Terence Gomez, how the NEP was used later as a means of patronage politics, or maintaining a form of patronage politics, a form of clientelist politics, which of course then serves the interests of not only the ruling party but the state apparatus. But does this actually help the Malaysian public as a whole? I think not. Now, of course, for me, one of the biggest flaws of the NEP was the way in which that it ostensibly was directed towards helping poor Malays, poor Bumiputras. But we see today in Malaysia, the persistence, the continued existence of so many other marginalized communities that do not come under the quote-unquote Bumiputra bracket, notably the poorer sections of the Malaysian community of Indian origin, particularly those in the estates. Now, so while in principle I'm not against affirmative action, I do worry when policies such as the NEP are instrumentalized for political reasons and used as a means of patronage politics. And of course this coincides in the 70s with the rise of a more strident form of Malay communitarian politics. It's not an accident that from the 70s onwards we see the rise of Malay nationalism that was defined in very narrow essentialist terms, and at the same time from the 70s, of course, we also saw the rise of a very narrow form of political Islam in Malaysia, which is now having its knock-on effects in the complex inter-religious dynamics in Malaysia. So all the problems we face today in Malaysia, whether it's the issue of the labeling of the Malaysian language, whether it's the use of the term Allah by non-Muslims, issues of religious freedom and conversion, all of these stem back to the 1970s with the rise of this sort of ethno-nationalist religious politics, which became one of the byproducts of the NEP.